Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to resume the Planning Commission meeting for Friday, August 21st at 12:45. And I'll just do a quick roll call of the commissioners. Tim Blanchard, are you back with us?
I am present.
David Kane. Not back yet. Mike Pickett. Steve Ruby. I see Steve's. No. Well, we will proceed in any event. And Adam, I trust you're with us.
I am, yeah, thanks. Let me get my screen shared here.
So we are moving to element B2, land use and rural introduction and rural character briefing with Adam Zach.
Great. So good afternoon. I'm Adam Zach, as Camille pointed out. Today we'll take a look at the introduction to the land use and rural element. And this will include a look at the definition of rural character. At your last meeting, we looked at the overall organization of the land use and rural element because it's going to be reorganized as we move forward in the comp plan update. And last month, we did kind of briefly touch on the introduction and the rural character definition, but today we'll take a bit of a closer look. So I would like to get your feedback on the content of the introduction to both the land use and rural sections of the element. And then also during our discussion today, you'll be able to provide that input on the rural character definition. Our discussion today will have a fairly narrow scope, looking specifically at the introduction on the land use section introduction on pages 1 through 10 of the draft element that was attached with the staff report. Also the rural introduction, which was on pages 40 through 43. And then possible amendments to the definition of rural character on page 41 of that document. The draft of the land use introduction, it integrates the growth forecasts that have been prepared throughout the comp plan update. This includes a summary of the housing and population forecasts, in addition to the land capacity analysis information. The introduction includes a high-level description of the current conditions and existing development in the county. And the introduction also describes the purpose and intent behind the goals and policies that follow in the element. So these are kind of the high-level setting the stage for those goals and policies. Looking at the introduction, you've had some time to think about this, and I'd like to ask if you have any recommended changes to that land use introduction, which is at the beginning of the element there. If you need, I have the document here. We can pull it up and go through your recommendations at the same time here. And as we work through these changes, you can agree to any kind of changes by consensus in a similar way you've done already today. So would you like me to pull up the document?
I think that, yes, I think that would be useful. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, Adam, if while you're going through it, if you can refer to the page number of the document that you're on while you're going through it, it'd be helpful also.
Sure. And I should point out too that this was attached with the staff report. So we're working from the same document that you had transmitted, and we only sent the one version of it this time, so it should be fairly straightforward. We're on page 5 of that draft, or actually, sorry, page 1. So it starts out here with just a general introduction explaining the purpose of the land use element and how it's laid out, and goes over some of the GMA requirements. And so I guess first, are there any notes on this first section 2.1?
Well, this is Tim. I just want to jump in again. I understand that the GMA uses the term urban, but I still resist the idea that San Juan County has to characterize an area such as East Sound, or even more clearly, other areas as urban, because it's really not. The county's not urban. The county is, as a whole, considered not only rural, but by some measures, frontier rural, at a national level based on the various definitions that are out there. So I think that we should be, if we have to use the term urban, we should, at least parenthetically, equate the term with urban growth area, as opposed to the characterization that we have areas that are urban and are just gone. And I say that for two reasons. First, and most important, gets to protecting rural character, but it comes up here because this is where we start running into calling things urban. I firmly believe that in order to satisfy the Growth Management Act, we need to be protecting not our rules to protect rural character have to extend to the character even of our urban growth areas. They're still urban. They're just allowed to have and required to have densities that would support urban growth, and happen to have certain government services necessary to support urban growth. They still have, however, strong elements of rural character. And if we fail to protect the rural character in our urban growth areas, then we're just wasting our time trying to protect it anywhere, because sooner or later the urbanization will spread out across the land, and that's just how it always happens. So we have to start by protecting the rural character of San Juan County, not just draw a line at the urban area and say, okay, anything goes in there. We no longer have to think about that. It's all bright lights, big city, and go for it. I think that would be a terrible mistake not to consider those elements of rural character that currently exist in East Sound and Lopez Village and Friday Harbor, for that matter, a very small town or rural community, even there. And I think if we just give in to this notion of urban as the Growth Management Act uses it without qualifying it some way, such as within urban growth areas or something like that, to indicate what we mean here in San Juan County, that we set ourselves up to fail. That's just my comment.
So if you look at on page 2, bullet point 3, designating urban, rural, and natural resource lands, would you insert UGA instead of rural? I mean, instead of urban.
On page 2?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean in bullet?
Well, it's at the top of the page. There are 4.
In the diagram in Figure 1.
Yes. I mean, where would you start?
Yeah. Well, I'd start right there. I'd say natural resource, rural, Lamoureux, and then I'd say urban growth area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And if the Growth Board wants to challenge us on that, if somebody wants to challenge us on that characterization, then it's entirely inconsistent with the Growth Management Act requirement that we protect rural character, in my opinion, because this position doesn't undermine anything else. It just gives us a stronger way of protecting rural. The only way, really, to protect rural character is to start at your most urban and try and prevent further loss of rural character within that area in which more intensive growth is permitted. Notwithstanding the comments that go ahead. Sorry, I'm a broken record, so somebody rein me in. So
yeah, so I would like to point out that within the GMA framework, the idea of rural character is very kind of narrowly applied to rural lands. So the only place that that phrase or mandate shows up is in relation to rural lands. I understand your point, and I think it's well made, but we may want to look at, instead of applying rural character, which is something that is specifically defined for rural lands, instead of applying that to our urban areas, we may want to look at a term more like community character. When you look at like the Lopez Village sub-area plan, does a good job of protecting the things that you're pointing out are important to protect about the village, about the small scale and things like that. But it's putting that through the lens of community character, that UGA, that the village has a certain character and we need to protect it. But in terms of rural character very specifically in GMA applies to the rural lands. And so we need to make sure that we're being specific about what we're talking about in each of those land use categories.
I understand that, and I actually thought that I was, because what we're required to do is to protect the rural character of the rural lands, but that technically doesn't apply to resource lands either. But in order to protect the character of those rural lands, we have to limit the urban character of everything in the county. That's, first off, consistent with the county. It's the only way to prevent urbanization from spreading out gradually over the rest of the county, including into the resource lands, which, while we don't have to protect the rural character of, I think we sort of do. And more important, even if the GMA didn't require it, our vision statement does. The vision statement is replete with the very clear indication that residents of San Juan County do not want to be further urbanized, that we want to be, and we can just go through and list all of the modifiers and all of the concepts that are in the vision statement that indicate that on a county-wide basis, which is what that vision statement relates to, we view ourselves as a rural community and do not ever want to be urbanized in the sense of urban character, not in the sense of density, because I will always bristle at the idea that the density defines rural character, because it really doesn't. That's why I say Friday Harbor doesn't feel like a city, right?
True, but it also doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like a rural area. I wouldn't characterize East Sound as a rural area. I think that it has it has an intensity of the built environment that is not rural. But we can point to those things through the plan. We can point to the things in East Sound that make it that are valuable to protect, without calling it rural character. I guess that's really my point, is that when we're thinking about rural character, we should be thinking specifically about rural lands. I get that we don't want to have the urban growth areas kind of become these things that sprawl out beyond the urban growth area boundary. But in terms of rural character, that really, we want to be pretty specific about how we're going about that. Now, to get to your point about possibly using the urban growth areas to prevent, that kind of spreading of urbanization outside of those urban growth areas, I think that's maybe more of a policy language thing. And when we get to urban goals and policies, maybe that's something that we want to incorporate in those goals and policies that drives at that kind of central idea about using the urban growth areas as a place to where rural character starts at the end of those urban growth areas. We can articulate something like that in the goals and policies for urban areas.
I just think that's ridiculous. And I mean, if that's what we think the GMA requires, then I don't. First of all, I don't read it that way. I read it as a requirement to protect rural character, the rural character of our rural lands. And I don't understand why they don't include the rural character of our resource lands in that either. I just don't understand why they've drafted it that way. I don't get it. But technically, we don't have to protect the rural character of our ag resource or our forest resources either. So, well, okay, we'll just have to. I suppose I just disagree about that. I think if we don't address roads and light and the degree to which we expand into having higher impact government services that require greater operating and maintenance expense, government facilities that are single taskers as opposed to multitasking facilities. If we don't have policies that focus on those aspects, some of those aspects of rural character in our UGAs, which is where those things are located, then we destroy the concept of ruralness from the beginning. And people are going to carry that with them when they leave the village of East Sound or when they leave Friday Harbor, because they will have had an urban experience there. And then it's not gonna work, I don't think. I fail to understand how you can do it. I think we've got to, well, what I've been trying to figure out is how do you go about advancing the vision statement that we don't want to be urban, that we want to be, that our vision is of a rural community. If we don't, then adopt and talk about those things that we don't want to have. In other words, the classic sociological definition of rural as what's left after the cities and the suburbs.
Right. Maybe what we need is a definition of urban as it applies to this county, if we're going to use that term. In other words, urban means one thing when you're in Seattle or New York or something else. Here it means something, very different.
Yeah, I think that's that would make sense to adopt a policy that kind of defines some of those things that Tim's pointing out and that make our urban areas unique to San Juan County, and that our urban growth areas are not Bellevue. They have their own character to them. I think that would be a good urban policy to adopt with this plan that would help kind of clarify that a bit more.
That's well put, because that is my point. Unlike most rural areas that I think this was designed to look at, we're not talking about rural pockets within a metropolitan area where you would have to draw a line and say the urbanization stops here. That's turning the concept on its head in a county like San Juan County, where we don't have a big city. We have only one city, only one town, of Friday Harbor. I would argue so we need to start by protecting. Well, I think those things I was talking about, focusing on what we don't think we want to have. We want to, and how to minimize the expansion of that sort of thing. But okay, so I jumped ahead. Maybe that doesn't belong in this introduction. Maybe that is a conversation we haven't fully had yet with folks, and this will come up in the other briefings as well, especially when we start to talk about rural clusters. So, sorry, I didn't mean to jump into it, but I'm getting anxious because things seem to be rolling along, and it may be hard to undo if, as I said at the outset of this, if we're buying into the idea that we actually have urban areas where the character is urban, because the character in East Sound is not urban. The density is, and granted, we've got some urban elements. We've got sidewalks. Okay, sidewalks make sense. They do make sense. Right now, the big fight the big issue in East Sound right now is do we have overhead streetlights? Which I think, as you might can tell, my view is no, we don't, because we don't have demonstrated need for it. No one's ever we haven't had the types of accidents that people are worried about because people here pay attention, and that's individual responsibility and that sort of thing, elements of the vision statement. So we need to fight that, because otherwise we'll be doing it at another intersection in town. If we go bright lights in East Sound, the next thing it'll be any intersection in town where somebody felt concerned at some point in time. We'll have traffic, we'll have street lights all over the place, and if we're not careful, we'll do it because we'll add a traffic circle. And if I understand it, state law requires those to have overhead lights. So all these things are very slippery.
Okay.
Yes or no?
I think point well taken, and let's go on.
Okay.
So I'll try to write something for the next time around because I don't have anything written yet, because I wanted to put out this general concept that we're giving away the high ground right off the bat, I think.
Been very articulate on the point, and I think we'll definitely revisit it.
So this is Mike. I had never read all this in the context of what Tim is saying, but do we need to use the word urban other than in urban growth areas, all caps? So that, I mean, from what I hear, the definition or the adjective of urban creates a conflict for our desire to be rural in the entire county, with the exception of urban growth areas, which are a defined term. So I'm just wondering if we went through this thing and looked at just where it says urban, and so does it need to say urban? Would that help in your concerns, Tim?
It would. It would address my concerns because we do have UGAs. They're a fact. They exist, and there's nothing wrong with it in the UGA context. But to throw in the towel and say those get to be cities is something we don't have to do if we don't want to, and it's consistent with our vision statement to do so.
Yeah, and I think if you think about all these Midwestern towns that are, have 1,000 people or 2,000 people live there, they don't think they have a city. They're a rural town. They're a rural area, a rural community, which is really what I think we've heard people want us to be as well and continue to be.
Stop talking about something that is not
Some background
We've got
noise.
somebody that's not muted. If you're a member of the public, or if you're Steve Ruby or somebody,
Yeah.
please mute yourself so we don't pick up your dryer conversation and that.
Okay. Well, I think it's very clear. We want to be very careful about going down any sort of urban slopes. So, Adam, you continue, please.
Okay. Yeah, and I do think, again, this is something that really, when we get to urban goals and policies, having a general policy that kind of discusses what's unique about urban development here would really help. To kind of return to Mike's point about, do we need to use the word urban? It's really kind of ingrained in the GMA language, and so it would be difficult to divorce our plan from that framework. But we can still use we can come up with how that really works here and define that locally. So I think we'll get there with the goals and policies. Returning to the introduction of the land use element. Again, we're looking for, if you've had a chance to read it, if you have any notes on the actual wording of the element that I have, or the introduction that I have pulled up here. I'll just walk you through the other sections. So we have a land use comment or a concept section, which was in the original plan, that kind of describes why the land use element has the goals and policies that it does, and what we're really trying to, how we're trying to accomplish certain goals here. It's a fairly high level.
I have a question.
Sure.
Which is in the last paragraph on page 1. The paragraph starts at line 35. My question arises, it begins at the end of line 37, And it says, required to designate, well, it starts in line 37. Counties required to designate urban growth areas inside of which growth may only occur if it is urban. I don't think that's correct. You have to plan to allow urban densities, but you don't. We have no way to compel growth at an urban density unless it happens. We have to plan for it.
Yeah, well, and so with the urban growth area, you have to allow urban levels of development within that UGA. And so, sorry, I'm just
right.
reading.
So I'm just reading the sentence. It says growth may only occur if it is urban. And what we really mean inside of which urban density growth is permitted, right? Or maybe we can even go further than that. It's you have to plan for urban density in that, but this is something I highlighted separately anyway, because we can't control growth. We can only control what we planned for.
So here I just made a change there. This is a working document, so I have the old one, but now it would say the GMA requires the county to designate urban growth areas inside of which urban growth is permitted and outside of which urban growth is not allowed.
Again, we don't have to permit urban growth. We have to permit urban densities. It's not the same thing.
Can't we just say? Why can't we just say?
It should say urban development.
Why can't we just say density? Urban density. It grows at higher densities than.
Sorry, Mike, I cut you off.
No, I was just, when I was reading these two sentences, I didn't understand. I mean, for definition, urban.
Madam Chair.
We all understand it, but it really is about density. It actually says it in one of these sentences. Urban growth occurs at higher densities than rural and resource land. In our case, it could be growth in urban growth areas occurs at higher. You can define this so you know you're talking about an urban growth area, not urban as an adjective to describe not rural. So
Excuse me,
I agree with you.
Excuse me? You guys, there's other people that are trying to speak, but they can't be heard. If you will let Camille acknowledge you one at a time, I think we'll get over some of the overlap of people speaking that's happening. So please.
Fair enough.
Michael, I don't know how much of what you said was heard. If you'd like to start, Camille will go down the rest of the group and see if they have anything to say.
All right. All I was saying is that what we were just talking about, this area, these two sentences, the use of the word growth, the use of the word urban, when it isn't related to urban growth areas, is, I mean, we can say things like higher density occurs in an urban growth area rather than in a rural or resource lands. And again, it's a defined term, not a adjective of character.
Okay. Steve Ruby or David Kane, do you have any comment you'd like to make here?
This is Steve Ruby. I don't have any comments at this time, but I got some later on. Thanks.
So.
Yeah, Madam Chair, David Kane here. I really like your idea that we have a San Juan County specific definition of what the word urban means within our context. That's it.
Okay. Adam, back to you.
Yes, I think that having a definition so that we are all in agreement on what constitutes urban growth or urban development, or however it comes up, I think that would really help with some of this, because it is a concept that we can use our goals and policies to really hone in on what is urban for us, because we have that local discretion to a certain extent. I mean, we can't necessarily the GMA requires us to allow sewer service in the UGA. That's part of urban development. Those kinds of things are maybe not, we can't locally determine, but we can determine what the character is for our urban growth areas. And we can do that through goals and policies. That's part of the purpose of having those goals and policies. And then that will help us when we get to a sentence that says something about urban development is permitted in the urban growth areas. We'll know what that urban growth or urban development is because we've defined what it is in the policy. We'll have a policy statement clarifying that.
Okay, is there consensus as to move forward with a definition that Adam would draft and we would review at some later date?
I think that should be our approach.
Okay, David, I sent.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, Steve?
Sorry, got to unmute. Yes.
And Mike, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I think that would be good, Camille. That's a good, as long as when we, if it, as a defined term,
Right.
it would be capital U, urban, as we go through discussion of what it means, what we can do. So it's a defined term, refers back to that definition instead of just by being capitalized.
Tim already said it.
Yes, I believe so. But Tim, are you circling back? Are you in agreement?
Yeah, I think that's the way to move forward.
Okay, we have consensus.
I was checking, according to what Adam has done here, he has highlighted a change in wording on that sentence where it says urban development is permitted. Are we going with that or are we not going with that?
Well, we already know, first off, we know we've got the limitation. We know that a number of us don't have any capacity since we have Max to see Adam's thing. So we can't really address that language under the circumstances that we have.
So the sentence,
I didn't know that.
yeah, so the sentence would read, the GMA requires the county to designate urban growth areas inside of which urban development is permitted and outside of which urban growth is not allowed.
I can live with that.
Okay. So the answer is yes.
And so everybody agrees? Good.
Steve, yes.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Did you have something? Okay. You're
Okay. So if I wasn't planning to go through this necessarily line by line. I was, do you have any other, did anything else jump out at you in your review of this document, of the introduction of the land use element? That's to the whole planning commission. We can go to specific passages like we just did.
It appears that I'm not hearing from any of the commissioners, so I think.
Okay, and this won't be the last time that we touch the land use element either. And so as we're reviewing it, we can continue to make changes until we get to, well, we've got a long time to make changes, so we'll be good in that department. So moving on to the rural introduction. This includes selections from the vision that address some of the rural topics. And in describing the rural lands, this introduction helps to establish the purpose for the rural section of the element, including those goals and policies that we'll get working on later. Another important piece of this introduction is kind of the high-level explanation of how the element satisfies the GMA requirements for a rural element of the plan. And finally, this introduction describes rural lands and existing development throughout the county. And if you have any changes to the first two sections of the introduction before we get into that rural character definition, we can take a look at those now.
Well, I guess I'll just carry on to driving some of this. In the second paragraph, the following portions of the vision recognize the importance. I think we miss a number of other opportunities, and in so doing, limit how we view the word character, which I think goes beyond how things look. Absolutely, its dictionary definition goes beyond how things look, and the GMA definition doesn't preclude that. For example, in community, we stop well short of talking about privacy, freedom, fostering a sense of neighborliness and of self-sufficiency. Those are all key concepts of rural character that have an impact potentially on development.
Tim, could begin where you are, which page you're on. Linda's asking.
I'm sorry, page 40, the introduction to the rural element sections, 3.1. The paragraph begins on page 10 and includes thereafter blocks and indented quotations from the vision statement. And what I was suggesting is that in community, we stop short. We should recognize that further down in the vision statement, it includes respect for others' privacy and freedoms. It also says foster a sense of neighborliness and self-sufficiency, all of which go to the character of land use and of development in an area. We then skip down all the way to natural environment, but before we get there, we've got the governance section of the vision, which recognizes the independent, self-reliant nature of its people. So rural character, rather, has to not interfere with that unnecessarily, has to recognize independence, self-reliance. Further down in governance, it talks about balancing responsibility with resources and costs. Again, in rural areas, in a rural county like ours, there is not the same availability of government resources. So you would expect to see development, particularly of county properties, developed in a manner that minimized operating costs, didn't unnecessarily increase maintenance costs, were designed in ways that were multitasking facilities as opposed to the opera house and the symphony hall or those types of things. So they could be practical and managed prudently. Those are all concepts right there in the government section. Beyond the government section, other areas that aren't mentioned here at all are for example, in the economy section. Recognizes rural, residential, quiet, agricultural, marine, and isolated nature of the islands. So that gets you the notion of quiet, agricultural, and isolated for sure, as elements that are part of that ethos. Part of that's the case, largely some of what it looks like, but also some of what it is. Certainly, the agriculture section would warrant a reference there as well. Then transportation. I believe we should certainly include transportation in there because it includes the idea that we don't expand or construct transportation infrastructure or facilities unless there's a demonstrated public need. You don't do that in a rural area because we're relying on people you're recognizing that people have this strong sense of independence and interdependence, self-reliance, rather than reliance on a government-provided everything. So those are all elements of rural character that shouldn't be done. And so those are characteristics that part of how we would protect it is by not interfering with it, making sure that we don't adopt a policy that undermines those qualities that the vision says we want to have. So we don't want to undermine people's self-reliance or people's independence or reliance on neighbors, because if we do, then we're undermining the vision statement, which I think is an even more important reason to protect rural character than the fact that the GMA requires it. So I would add those things.
Okay. Maybe instead of, because I think if we're just taking a lot of the vision statement and reiterating it here, it's kind of duplicating things that are in other parts of the comprehensive plan. It might be more valuable, instead of having the full vision statements sections here, maybe pull out those things that are most important from the vision statement, like self-reliance, those things that you just listed, and have more of a bullet point list of these are things, concepts from the vision that specifically help or define what is rural. Something along those lines, as part of a way to avoid having the plan say the same thing twice in two different spots. Would that be an acceptable way to go?
That works for me. I just didn't want to set up a system where someone could say, no, that's not what you meant by rural character, because you mentioned these other things, you didn't mention that. And some of those are the more important things, I think. The others are about how it looks, not the other aspects of character. So I would avoid playing into that.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're in agreement?
Well, and this is just my view. There are people who want the picture postcard, and to me, that's inconsistent with rural character. It's inconsistent with right to farm. It's everything else. But there are folks who want the picture postcard, and this plays into that. I mean, as it's currently drafted.
Okay.
So I just want to be thoroughly transparent with what I think happens if we went with these things. We play into the picture postcard notion where we're going to freeze everything in place. And I don't think that's consistent with the Growth Management Act, and it's certainly not my view of rural character.
Okay, so this proposal in terms of, excerpting portions of what you delineate.
Well, I think that Alan has the idea based on his description, I could draft a paragraph too, I suppose, but I think that that's the idea. Just add in some of these other concepts that relate to, the character of rural areas.
Yeah. I think this is Adam again. I think that a bullet point list instead of the full statements of the vision might be a more effective way to get the ideas across without reiterating something that's already in the plan. I'll put something together for our next draft. I think we'll have a little bit more, that this will be more concise, but still include all those concepts.
Thanks.
Let's see. So if that covers the kind of first part of the introduction to rural character, but an important part of this introduction is that definition. We've been talking about it a bit through our discussion here, but now is where we'll actually get into the wording of rural character, that definition that we've adopted in the county code. The primary purpose of designating rural lands, as we've talked about earlier today, is to preserve the rural character of those areas. And ultimately, our rural goals and policies and regulations will seek to preserve rural character as we define it. The GMA has a definition of rural character in its definitions, and during the update, sorry, I lost my place there. So the GMA has a definition of rural character. The county has adopted a definition of rural character that's pretty much the GMA definition, but they did have one addition, and we'll look at that here in a second. During the update, we can consider kind of adding to this definition or making it unique to San Juan County. As we consider amendments, our focus should be on the possible additions to the definition that make it fit the unique character, rather than removing components that are included in the state definition. So we don't want to we don't want to end up with a definition that would be counter to how the state defines it, but we can make it more unique to us. The definition in the current draft of the land use element is the adopted definition from San Juan County Code 1820-180. So it starts with this statement here, that rural character means a quality of the landscape dominated by pastoral, agricultural, forested, and natural areas interspersed with single-family homes and farm structures. Rural character refers to the patterns of land use and development established by the comprehensive plan, and then it gets into a list, and we'll look at each item from the list here in a minute. The sentence that was added when the county adopted this definition is a quality of the landscape dominated by pastoral, agricultural, forested, and natural areas interspersed with single-family homes and farm structures. So this is kind of where we're really keeping it high level of how we're defining rural character. And at this point, if we have changes to this first section, we can take a look at that.
So it's
so if hopefully some of you can see my screen, and I've got the statement that we're looking at here pulled up. I'll just highlight it for you.
For those looking at a paper document, he's looking on page 41,
Thank you.
and it goes over to page 42.
So this has some key elements here. It has a pastoral, agricultural, forested, and natural areas interspersed with single-family homes and farm structures. So that's really kind of describing what do our rural lands look like in general.
So that's the picture postcard version.
A bit. It's also, I think, a statement. It's a statement about what are our rural lands? They're pastoral, agricultural, forested, and natural areas. So I think that if I were writing a single sentence to sum up, I don't know, driving along Orcas Road, I think that would capture what I'm seeing and what that experience is like. But there may be other things that the Planning Commission would like to add to this list or not.
No, I think. Go ahead.
Mike, would you like to start?
Yeah, I guess this is mostly about land, and I guess that's appropriate because this is land use. Number two, I mean, are we going down below the rural character definition? Or just that 3-sentence in green? Is that what we're talking about?
Ideally, we would focus on each part of this as we go. But if you have comments on it,
so I don't have any comment on the part that you highlighted, Adam.
Okay.
Lines 39, 40, and 41.
Yes, thank you.
Right.
David?
Yeah, sorry, I got lost there. Skype dropped me. So under the rural character definition, we were moving past that. Are we talking about the individual 1, 2, 3, 4 points below it at this point?
We're still on the first on lines 39, 40, and 41 of page 41.
Yeah, I like that. The only word I might wish to harmonize would be I would change farm structures to agricultural structures.
you have a response to that, Adam?
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
This is Tim. Can I offer a suggestion? We have agricultural, and we also mentioned forest and forested and natural areas. So farm structures is how people have generally thought about some of those things, but from the road you wouldn't know if it wasn't a sawmill, for example, of a small scale that used to operate in San Juan County. So, and in a rural area, it wouldn't be uncommon to find other sorts of structures as well, because a barn you'd view as a farm structure, but it really doesn't matter if the person's using it as a barn, or if the person's using it as a structure in which they process some agricultural goods or forest goods or whatever other cottage industry they might be operating in a rural area. So maybe we go to a more general term than farm and just say, well, I don't know. I don't want to get into any of the technicalities of calling it a pertinence versus a auxiliary or what. We want a term that doesn't have meaning because we're being general. Yeah.
David proposed agricultural.
Yeah, which would exclude a sawmill, though, is the thing, or a barn in which, or the building in which somebody is currently making distilled spirit.
Well, yeah, okay.
Well, I would argue that a distillery would be an agricultural activity, and so it would be an agricultural structure. and I think the land use table is 1830, 60.
Yeah,
I forget.
Would support
citation.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think portable sawmills they're called out. So I hear you. I just like the word agriculture. I think it's broader than farm.
I'm okay with it as long as it doesn't exclude forest. So yeah, let's run with it.
Okay.
I think that captures it still paints that kind of picture a bit visually. Let's see. So then moving on to the components that make up rural character. The first component is a pattern of land use and development in which open space, the natural environment, and vegetation predominate over the built environment. This comes directly from the GMA definition. And this statement might not need amendment because it really is describing areas with less intense development, which seems to be one of the really highly valued components of rural character here. So in my opinion, this statement fairly captures that concept of open space, natural landscape, and vegetation rather than buildings.
And so something like maximum lot coverage would come further on.
Right. So when we would be looking at maximum lot coverage, that's a rural policy that is implementing this kind of concept from rural character. And so you can look to rural character and say that, we're saying that open space is important there, and that's why we require open space in rural lands, is to preserve this aspect of rural character. That's kind of the directionality of this definition.
Okay.
And for those that can't see the screen, this is page 41, lines 44 and 45.
Well,
I think that's right. I mean, just to try and move us along, I think that's right. I actually think the only one of these first four that I would perhaps augment, and I wouldn't change it. I would augment it to demonstrate that what we're doing is consistent with what the GMA provides, is number 2, because that's where I read into that these things about independence and self-reliance and balancing the types of services that are provided, limited budgets, that sort of thing that you normally think of in that landscape. So I think that picks up that. Just to move it along, and then somebody else jump in and tear this all up if that makes sense. The third one, landscapes traditionally found, I think that's fantastic because to some people they will see that as the picture postcard. Others will see a feedlot and or a hog farm because that certainly would be traditionally found in rural areas. That would work. This also picks up communities, which is useful because it kind of goes arguably beyond just the agricultural and so forth. Visual landscapes. This is one where underneath that we get to say, gosh, we don't want curbs and center medians and streetlights because that's not what you traditionally see, and we'd have the ability to define that and address some of those road elements that we don't want to have, maybe. Those places where we could say we don't want it. But I don't think that requires any edit. I think that's already there in terms of traditionally found.
This is Mike.
Forward to
The only thing about number 2 that I wonder about is rural-based economies, and whether that's inconsistent with the concept of being okay and actually wanting to have high technology work at home jobs rather than, I mean, in addition to what you might otherwise think is a rural-based economy. So I don't know if there's an inconsistency there, or if it leaves it out, or if we would consider that somehow a rural-based economy.
Well, it does go on to say, and opportunities to both live and work in rural areas.
Yeah, I just remember in other parts of what we've done here, we actually wanted to encourage
Telecommuting.
Right.
occupations, jobs, economies that are more advanced, progressive than farming necessarily.
Well, telecommuting and things like that. But I think those aren't inconsistent. There have always been authors who've retreated to their rural community, for example, to write and work on things. It's just things have evolved now so that you can write software here too. So I don't think that that's inconsistent. It may not be traditional.
It does specifically say rural-based, not necessarily like resource-based or something that's pointing to a certain industry. It's just, I think the idea is that the rural-based economy would not be a factory that's employing 200 people or something. You know, that's not a rural-based economy.
Factory probably not, but you could have a rural-based economy that employed 200 people at harvest.
Yes,
for sure. And within the facility for preparation for shipment, if that's the way you went, that would certainly be consistent. I don't know that that's what we want, but I'm not too worried that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
But the concept here, we could elaborate on traditional rural lifestyle. What is a rural-based economy? If you feel like that needs to be more specific or specifically include telecommuting, that's something that we could think about adding to the definition here.
Well, yeah, I mean, traditional rural-based lifestyle is a nice, broad concept, but you could readily pick up on lots of themes where a rural lifestyle is you live on the land and you go into town when you need supplies, or for a social occasion of some sort. And so that's completely consistent with anybody who works at home and that sort of thing. For example, you always had a rural-based lifestyle. You had your rural doctor, you had your rural lawyers. Your rural lawyer was a little different than me because your rural lawyer worked for people in the community, whereas my clients are scattered across the country, but not here generally. So I've got that advantage over that rural lawyer in the past. So those are certainly rural lifestyles, and nothing ever said you had to be in town to do that work.
Mm-hmm. So moving to number 3 here, which is that provide a visual landscape traditionally found in rural areas and communities. This is another spot where we could elaborate on some of the aspects of the visual landscape that are valued, such as like open space, or what are some of the unique characteristics of the visual qualities. Here, this is on line 50 of page 41.
Yeah, I'm not sure it needs elaboration, because when we get into policies, I hope we'll be talking about roads a little bit and things like that. But that ties back a bit to what's it look like.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that gets into a more nebulous concept of character as well, because to be fair, having driven across the country last summer, in both directions, there's huge interstate highways that run through a whole lot of areas that are undisputably rural. And those aren't rural roads. But what's great about that is you fall off the highway and you're on a road that's hardly wide enough. It's not wide enough for you and an agricultural truck. Just not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the traditional road, and we're somewhere in between. So, but certainly much closer to that rural road.
Okay, so we are agreed that the
I don't think it needs to change.
more
What I'd be saying.
aspects would come later on. Okay. What about? Okay.
All right.
Still,
So moving to number 4 on the list, this is page 42, line 1. So it's a pattern of land use and development that are compatible with the use of the land by wildlife and for fish and wildlife habitat. So again, this is another one that's a pretty folks really value this aspect in a lot of the public comments that we get. I'm sure you're aware. The environment in general is fairly popular here. So we can consider adding a description of the qualities of rural lands that are compatible with habitat, such as like open space again, or just any other component of rural lands that's compatible with the use of land. Otherwise, this is fairly broad and maybe doesn't need that kind of specificity.
Yeah, David Kane here. I take some exception with this, but because as a farmer or aspiring farmer, wildlife like deer, which may or may not be indigenous, are a great burden to the farms here, and as we all struggle with our more food resiliency in our home gardens and our large fields of grain, having the deer eat our crops and destroy our gardens is a challenge. So I find this somewhat worrisome that our farms not compatible with land use because the wildlife is prioritized.
I don't think we run. I hear what you're saying. I don't think we run into that, and I don't think that's an intended distinction between resource lands and rural farm forest, for example. I just don't think it is. And certainly San Juan County development pattern doesn't have that clear distinction between resource land as residential places and rural farm forest as residential places, if one looks around, because so I don't think that's a problem. I mean, that's right from the state definition of rural character, but these are sort of, an inclusive list. You got the visual landscape, you got that are compatible. I think the land is compatible. It's just problematic. I mean, if that makes sense. and it's compatible with some wildlife too, and not just all of it, right? The deer are a problem. The deer team up with the raccoons if you're raising chickens. The deer are not a problem for the chickens. The deer and the raccoons and hawks are a problem if you're raising chickens potentially, and things like that. But by and large, you're not incompatible with most things. So I don't think that can't be what they mean. Consistent with the first element, or the first item 1.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my concern is more urban people from urban backgrounds move into the rural areas. They tend to bring their urban values with them. The deer are so cute. Let's feed the deer, and the foxes are so cute. Let's feed the foxes, and pretty soon the farmer who has his chickens in his grain field is now persecuted for trying to protect his crops. So I'm not sure that this really resounds with me. I think if we think about other urban areas in the country, I don't think this is one of the things they would potentially prioritize. Now, that said, I'm a huge supporter of the natural habitat in our sensitive marine areas, and don't want it to be misconstrued. But I'm just wondering if this is critical to the definition of our rural character.
This is part of, or this comes directly from the GMA definition of rural character, and part of the GMA framework includes having regulations for critical areas, which include habitat, and so this is kind of part of that, or is included because of that piece of GMA. So. I feel like I'm not articulating my point well, but we wouldn't want to lose this, but maybe we can find ways to elaborate on it if needed. But I don't think that this is necessarily saying that farmers can't farm their crops and protect their crops from species that may be problematic.
With tongue in cheek, how about adding deer hunting as an agricultural service?
This is Steve. I'd like to make a comment about this. When you're talking about rural character, part of it has to do with the way the land has been inhabited not only by people, farmers, and fishermen, but also by the creatures also here. And I think they have an equal stake in this, or have a significant stake in this. And so that, traditionally, the farmers have dealt with what they refer to as pests. And this statement here does not prevent them from dealing with pests that interfere with their agricultural pursuits. Okay, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, this is Mike. I understand what David's saying, being a farmer myself and having deer around here. But I do think the way it's phrased is that rural character is and rural character has a big agricultural part of it in our definition, and it's compatible with the use of land by others, wildlife, fish, and wild habitat. I think it's compatible is a good word for it. So I think I'm okay with the way it is, but I appreciate David's comments.
Okay, David can't hear. Okay, I'm happy to move along.
Okay. So
I think that brings us to 5.
moving on, to number 5, which is line 3 of page 42. So it's patterns of land use and development that reduce the inappropriate conversion of undeveloped land into sprawling, low-density development. This is one of the primary focuses of the GMA, is to keep the keep the areas outside of our urban growth areas at a less intense level of the built environment, and keep that low density development, the kind of sprawling residential development out of the rural lands. Here we can consider adding kind of a general description of some of the like non-sprawling aspects of our rural lands. Something like a mention of that we have large lot sizes in our rural areas, or that the open spaces predominating there help address sprawl. But I would open it up to you for your comments.
This is Steve. Yeah, I support that. I think that probably, yeah, I think you could add something to it with, I don't know about example. That probably is not the right phrase, but something that would flesh it out a little bit more.
This is Mike. Something about sprawling low density development seems somewhat inconsistent to me, those words. Either, you know what I mean? Sprawling low density development. Was that a house every 10 acres, or is that some, I don't know. I don't quite understand the concept.
That's something that is challenging about the GMA, is that throughout it uses this phrase sprawling low density development, but never defines what that is. And so, typically it's thought of as anything that's on a smaller lot that's not quite like a quarter acre size lot. So something between a quarter acre and 1 acre is often kind of pointed to as probably a pattern of sprawl. But even that's not necessarily true across the board. It's a really difficult term to kind of get your arms around here. And so part of my thought is that we may want to kind of define that for ourselves here about what do we consider sprawl, or what are we trying to avoid there. That might be a helpful addition to the definition.
So would that, a minimum lot size, for instance?
Right. I mean, we wouldn't want to, here in the definition, we don't want to necessarily create a regulation. So we don't want to say a specific size, but it could be something like maybe our larger lots in the rural area help preserve or help prevent sprawl, something along those lines. Again, to kind of draw back to it, when we are establishing a minimum lot size, we can point back to the definition and say that we want to preserve our large lots because that's part of our definition of rural character. So something along those lines of our large lots, our large rural lots help prevent the inappropriate densities or sprawl.
Yeah, if you could work on something like that, that would be helpful. I just think having it in there asks a lot of questions and provides opportunity for confusion.
Well,
so
this is Tim again. This is one of those sections. I mean, this language is right from the GMA definition, so we're not getting away from it. And the concept of sprawl in the Washington GMA is an interesting concept anyway, and not entirely consistent with the way it is in some other places. But still, the idea is we would like to see open land and open fields and stuff like that, and have the houses in some situation that doesn't look sprawly, I guess. Someone could do a better job with that, but we can deal with that in the definitions as they're going to come up anyway, because either we have zoning of 5 or larger acre lots for the most part, or we're going to be later today talking about rural clusters and how to do those in a way that doesn't offend some of these definitions by clustering those homes in a place rather than having them sprawled out in other places. So the goals and policies will help us deal with that, I think.
Yeah.
Mike, your issue with the term sprawling low density as being hard to define or, ambiguous. I mean, if you use terms like proportion or suitability, does that get us closer?
I don't know. I always have always had a problem with anything that is somewhat vague or hard to define. I've always felt better with something that's pretty specific that you can look to, that's defined terms, etc. So, what we're trying to do here is, it scares me to think that sprawl would be quarter-acre lots, and that's low density or something. That isn't what I would think of as what we want. So I'm not quite sure how to wordsmith it, Camille, but that's more what I think.
And I'd like to clarify that I didn't mean to say that quarter-acre lots would be sprawly. It's usually sprawl is thought of typically as like a lower density than that, but not quite as low as 1 unit per 5 acres. So just for a clarity on that, because our UGAs have a quarter-acre density, and that's an urban density as we've defined it. Sorry, Tim, I cut you off.
No, I was going to say something similar. I think we'll be able to address this in the goals and policies in a way that will make our comprehensive plan consistent with the reduction of inappropriate conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right, good.
We've already done it pretty well. The question is, going forward, can we keep it? Yeah.
Is the idea that staff is going to come back with different wording or no?
I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
There you go, Adam.
Thank you, Linda.
Yep.
So the last two aspects are fairly technical. These are one that rural development does not require the extension of urban governmental services. So that would be like sewer service or curb, gutter, or sidewalk, those kinds of things. And then number 7, it's patterns of land use that are consistent with the protection of surface water flows and groundwater and surface water recharge and discharge areas. A key idea in the Growth Management Act is that we're planning for stormwater runoff and protecting wetlands and things like that. So those really get at those two ideas from the GMA and probably don't need a ton of elaboration at this point. But I would welcome additional comments on that too.
Hearing none.
I think those are fine. We'll just address them in the goals and policies.
Mm-hmm.
So David Kane here. Question. So I think, did we only change one word in this rural definition, or the rural character definition, where I wanted to put in structures instead of farm buildings? Or, I'm sorry, agricultural instead of farm?
David,
that and a placeholder to incorporate some of those other qualities into number 2.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't want to belabor the process if this requires a code amendment to change the word farm to agriculture. I just want to make sure we're spending our time in high use areas here.
I think it just requires consensus.
right. So I take it's by consensus that we're changing the word farm to agricultural in the definition there. I was wondering if there were any other things you were doing by consensus.
Is there something in number 2? That was number 2.
Yeah, and I don't know that we have to change it now or put that in. I think what I said I would do is come up with some additional language that melds into that section about rural lifestyles. Some of those qualities I was also pulling out of the vision statement. Independence, neighborliness, cooperation, that kind of stuff all fits in that lifestyle element there, and would give us a place to refer back to and kind of put our stamp on it.
Okay.
We can do that next time around so people have a chance to look at it, because try to do it live now will take too much time.
The one I'm talking about is in the actual definition of rural character between lines 39 and 42, that instead of saying farm structures, it now says agricultural structures, and that was by consensus, correct?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for the confusion.
Okay. So, Adam.
Mm-hmm. That's the other parts of the introduction here for rural. Touch on the existing rural development, which really is, let me just get there in my presentation. So they help establish kind of the state of rural lands at the time this plan is adopted. And so what's helpful about this is the next time we look at rural goals and policies, we can take a look at this section, and it'll help us consider how things might have changed in the 20 years since the last time the plan was adopted. It's a really high level description of kind of existing development throughout the rural lands. And then if you have any proposed changes here, this is on, it starts on line 30 of page 42 of the document you have and goes through the next page, 43, line 18.
There were comments that I think there were comments in the end of the Friends comments that I think would be more appropriate if these were regulatory rather than descriptive. So I just want to acknowledge that we had read those and seen those. I think what's here is intended to be descriptive,
yes,
and not regulatory. So changing things to shall and things like that would make sense in a regulatory sense, but as it is, we're just stating a fact, or what we're asserting as the circumstance. So I just wanted to I'd like to let people know we've read their comments. So anyway, that's what I think that one is. There's a few others on some other pages. Can I ask about the bullet points between 13 or between 16 and 27? There are a few others there are probably some others I would add, but one I would add for sure is adopting scenic road standards or rural road standards. That doesn't borrow the language exactly from the transportation element, but that's essentially capturing the idea. Does that make sense, Adam?
Yeah, that there's establishing that link between rural character and rural roads.
Yep. Well, it's one of the policies that we would adopt to protect rural character. We could just call it rural road standards or whatever. But what we're talking about is incorporating the concepts from the Scenic Roads Manual. But
okay,
if that's not the language we'll be using, I wouldn't say we ought to put it in just to change it. But rural road standards for San Juan County or something like that. Just so we've got that placed in there. That's just because it's a big deal.
Sure.
So you want to add that as a bullet?
Yes, please.
So page 42, that would be probably coming on around line 30.
Somewhere, yep.
You'd insert it there. Okay, rural road standards.
Yep. There's one other comment too, and that's at line 25. It says limiting the extension of services beyond existing service areas. I think we want to say limiting the extension of urban government services.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so there are two changes. Does everybody have that? So at line 25 would read, limiting the extension of urban government services beyond existing service areas.
I've got that one, Madam Chair.
Okay.
It's the other one I'm a little confused about.
29 would be rural road
Standards.
standards.
And that's just bullet.
Yes.
And those are by consensus?
Does anybody abstain from consensus? By consensus. Okay. Anna.
Okay, so just one more thing, kind of looking ahead at the next steps for the land use element. We'll be later today. We'll go through some of the land use issues, and then next month we'll get some more feedback from you on those issues, and then we'll also take a look at natural resource lands. And then in October we'll follow up on resource lands and additional land use issues. And then in November, December, January, around the turn of the year, we'll be developing those land use alternatives. So we're really working toward getting the public hearing draft of this land use element ready to go in the next couple of months. And then let's see, public comments. We'll go over this here in a minute. If there's any other questions about the land use element before we get into the land use issues, I can take those now, and we'll get myself ready for the next presentation.
Yeah, there were a couple. There were a couple of other comments that essentially ask us to confirm some facts that were in here. And Friends asks that we confirm the statement that the densities, the allowed densities in areas outside of Lambert activity centers and master planned resorts range from 1 per 5 to 4 per acre, 1 to 5 acres to 4 per. Well, anyway, they're wondering whether we've got the facts right, and I can't speak to it because I didn't try to do it, but I wanted to make sure we'd looked at that so we can address that question. And then there was a similar question.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And then I think there's another question about water. It's page 43, line 51. Page 43, lines 1 and 2. Where is it? It's water is what it. Wait a second. Page 40.
At the top of the page. 43. Residential area density in these areas is the availability of water and septic services.
Yeah, that's going to be where it is. The question is whether that's valid given the authorization for desal.
Right, I remember that question.
Well, so part of that is that if you're having an on-site septic system, typically you have to have a larger lot. And usually that's a half-acre lot to accommodate the septic system in addition to the single-family residence. And so that does kind of limit how high we can set the density in some areas. Deer Harbor Hamlet is a good example. There are places that, because of the septic limitations, they can't go to a higher density than what's assigned on the map. So that's what's behind that statement there.
So is this identifying an issue that we currently have that isn't compliant or isn't conforming, or maybe neither?
Neither. It's just pointing to the fact that there are some places that we can't have higher density because there's limits to the resources on the site, or the septic capabilities there. So
so that's a good thing as long as we in fact impose and monitor those limits.
Right, and as long as we don't set a density somewhere that can't actually be supported by what is able to be built there. That's one of the key ideas of the when you're setting densities is you don't want to allow, say that you allow 100 units in this area, but actually you could only build 50 or whatever. So that's definitely something that we would want to look at as we establish density. But here, this is just a statement of why there's a limit in some places.
Now, the last thing that the Friends mentions in their letter is one that goes to the heart of some of how we develop the goals and policies for this, and that is the suggestion of a goal that would say, protect rural character of the county. Development regulations require the natural environment to predominate over the built environment in most residential rural areas. So that calls for a definition of what we mean by predominate, or at least, well, at least some reference to. See, I don't even know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we address that, because we have existing densities. Folks have existing property rights that are around, and so either we've done a good job or we've got a problem, I guess. Although, to be fair, the goal does say in most residential rural areas. So perhaps that's the way we deal with an historical situation where it might exist. But they don't suggest what the goals are, what the policies under that ought to be. But it's certainly something we've got to evaluate. And predominate's an interesting word.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we should be okay, because even on 5 acres, how much is your house going to take up? In most cases, if we deal with lot coverage, we're probably okay in terms of predominate at the parcel level. And we've got, I guess we have to look at the maps to see whether there's any other approach to shoring up GMA compliance on that basis.
Right. And yeah, I mean, we have standards like open space standards, setback standards, things like that that help with that, keep the open space and the built natural environment predominating over the built environment.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we'll have to think about in terms of writing it down, but looking around, at least in most places, it seems like we're doing okay. But again, that's the kind of statement that calls for verification. So anyway.
Are there any other questions or comments before we move on to the land use issues?
No.
No? Okay.
Land use.
All right. So today, Sophia and I will go over 4 land use issues that have come up during the comprehensive plan update. And these issues can be addressed during the update by adopting, goals and policies in our land use and housing elements, and by concurrent code amendments as we adopt the comp plan update. Today we'll go over the issues and some possible solutions that we've drafted for those land uses. And we'll look at farm worker accommodations, rural residential cluster development, accessory dwelling units, and vacation rentals. These are things that have been brought up by the public, the Planning Commission, and the County Council kind of throughout our comp plan update process. After going over the issues, we'll ask you to just kind of discuss the options for each and ask us any questions that you'd like more clarification on, or any alternatives that maybe we haven't considered yet. And then we expect today's discussion to kind of bleed over into our September meeting, where we can respond to those questions and comments about these specific issues. Let's see here. And ultimately your feedback on these topics will help inform our future drafts of the land use and housing elements. And the policy direction will really help us prepare those possible code amendments that we'll adopt with the comp plan update to implement the update. The first issue we'll look at is farm worker accommodations. This is a residential use that's associated with agricultural labor, which is a fairly broad definition, which really allows for a variety of options for accommodating workers. And it's broad because it doesn't specifically call out dwelling units. So accommodations could be provided in something that's not a complete dwelling unit with a kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom. So something like a bunkhouse or something along those lines. The performance standards for farm worker accommodations are established in San Juan County Code 1840-230. This allows for accommodations of up to 10 workers. And there's a requirement that the site be in the assessor's tax category of ag open space. And this helps to ensure that the site is currently used for agricultural production. We'll take a closer look at this requirement in a minute. It's one that we've received some comments on. And also the code here also requires that accommodations only be provided for workers directly involved in the on-site operation. Farm worker accommodations must be subordinate to on-site ag activities, and the locational requirement that these accommodations be placed on the lot to minimize the ag land loss helps to ensure that this use doesn't affect the commercial productivity of farmlands, which is one of the GMA requirements for ag land. And finally, the accommodations cannot require the extension of public sewer and water services. So they need to have adequate on-site sewage disposal. Three issues that have come up about or around farm worker accommodations are first that the ARC has requested removing that requirement that the farms participate in the current use or open space tax program. Another issue is allowing temporary accommodations such as like tiny homes on wheels or RVs. And then finally, some comments have suggested clarifying how the state farm worker housing program works. So we'll look at each of these individually. First, we'll look at the requirement for that farms participate in the open space and current use tax programs to be eligible for farm worker accommodations. The Agricultural Resources Committee, or ARC, has requested that this requirement be changed in order to make more farms eligible for farm worker accommodations. In the county, there are some farmers that don't participate in the tax program, but could benefit from providing farm worker accommodations. Some farmers have a really hard time finding seasonal labor for the harvest time, and so they could really use some accommodations in that regard. On the other hand, this requirement really helps to ensure that the farm is currently being used for agriculture and that it continues to be used in the future. The current use and open space programs have a penalty if the farmers stop using the property for ag production. And so that kind of helps guarantee that it will continue to be ag land. One of the benefits of easing this requirement is that it would allow more farms to provide farm worker accommodation. As I mentioned, farmers have a hard time finding work in the summertime finding workers in the summertime because there's limited places for them to stay. One of the drawbacks of removing this requirement is that it could make it easier for some property owners to develop accommodations that aren't necessarily active farms because we wouldn't have that confirmation that the current use and open space programs grant. And then it also removes that penalty for changing the use from agricultural use. Three of the options that staff has come up with to address this issue is to allow farm worker accommodations provided that either the owners participate in the current use or open space program or if they can demonstrate that they are eligible for those programs. Option B would be to allow farm worker accommodation without requiring participation in the open space or current use program at all. And option C would be to make no change and continue to require participation in the program. As I mentioned, the staff recommendation is option A. Demonstrating eligibility is a good way to show that the property is an active farm without necessarily requiring that they participate in the current use or open space program. This would allow more farms to develop farm worker accommodations without allowing it in places that aren't necessarily commercial agriculture operations. It also effectively accomplishes the aim of the ARC's proposal by making it easier for farmers to develop farm worker accommodations. But it still keeps some requirements in place for that. So now I would turn it over to you for your discussion on if you have questions or comments on this issue.
Adam, roughly how many farms would you say would be eligible but choose not to participate? Do you have any idea?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know that we have, so we don't necessarily have a list of farms, but we have some data sets that show us where farms probably are. So I could take a look at that for next time and let you know how many farms are eligible and how many would be in the if we made the change.
This is Mike. I don't see that the benefit of using the assessor's designation outweighs the ability of people who don't want that designation to be able to farm and be part of our agricultural economy and have farm workers. So, the extra burden on the farmer would be to prove that they would otherwise qualify. And I think if they go through that, they ought to be able to do housing. So I agree with the staff's recommendation.
Other comments, David?
Yeah, David King here. The problem with that, Mike, and is that you have to proof out your income for what was it 3 years out of the last 5 years. So we know in the county that we have farmers that are the average age of a farmer in our county is what in excess of 60 years, 65 years old, and we want new farmers to replace them presumably. And we want to have sustainable food production in our communities, and we want to support local farms. Yet a new farmer is not only faced with the economic hardship of trying to acquire land that may not be generation, they may not have been inherited or had acquired many, many years ago, and now they have to wait 3 to 5 years to proof out that they are eligible per the open space requirements or the CUPA requirements. So I think that's a real hardship. Now, I know that option B creates some loopholes, but I feel like that's a lesser evil than creating too many barriers for new and young farmers that are financially struggling and that really do need that housing.
This is Tim. That's what I was wondering, whether there's some other way to build in the protections. Granted, we don't. If we do that, we don't have a lever to lever people into current use or open space, which gives us some other benefits and assurance. However, is there some other? What can we include that is practical that would provide some teeth? And how can we minimize the verifying aspect that would be required of? I guess in this case we wouldn't be able to. Community development wouldn't be able to rely on the assessor's office.
Yeah, so this has been, as a chair of the ARC policy committee for the last couple of years, this is an issue that we deliberate frequently, and we're really concerned that there's going to be unintended consequences of opening up some farm worker housing and that it's going to be abused. However, that said, we think that we've come up with a couple different scenarios. One, which I personally favor, is that if you file taxes as a farmer, if you file a Schedule F to the IRS, then you are a farm, and I think that's a pretty nice test. That sort of prevents someone having one chicken on their property and calling it a farm, and then having farm worker accommodation. So, and I also think that those people that you house on your farm, you need to pay them. And there needs to be a minimum threshold. So how do we prove those things? I think there's maybe an annual certification, and maybe people have to self-certify, and some people will gamify it and certainly try to cheat. But I think all in all that we really need to encourage small farms, young farmers, and I think that's super integral to our rural character. If we put too many barriers up, and that's the consensus amongst the farm community right now, is there's too many barriers, then we're going to become, that I think there's the consequences to that outweigh liberalizing it a bit more by simply a simple test like a Schedule F annual certification, something like that.
So let me ask Adam or Erica. Oh, sorry, I cut someone off. I apologize. So, sorry, Camille.
Yeah, no, Tim. I just want clarity from David.
Wait,
David,
Erica's up next.
Yeah, this is Mike.
Mike,
I'm sorry.
Erica has.
Yes. Can I speak, Camille? Request? I ask.
Right after Erica's comment, Michael.
Oh, okay.
I think I can probably answer. I think you were wanting to know, and probably your questions were on whether or not we would be able to look at a Schedule F or if we could do an annual certification. Yes, we can do an annual certification. We do them for vacation rentals, and soon we'll be doing them for barge landings. Where you may get my point here is that there's only so many annual certifications you can do without making your planning department get more and more people in it and cost more money. Beyond that, I think the Schedule F is a good idea. Our other thought was that what if we are very concerned about the loophole. So the Schedule F is I think is a good way. I don't know what the minimums are on that. The other thought we had was just allowing anybody who has an ag resource designation to be able to participate, even if they aren't showing that they have farms, because that's a way of encouraging people to actually keep their land in a resource designation. So that's what I had.
Michael?
Thank you. David, so a Schedule F would require somebody to wait 18 months, 2 years. They have to have 1 year and then file the return, right? So there's some delay there. And the second question I have is, I recall when I purchased this farm, I had to submit a farm plan and showing my projected revenue and all the things I was going to do, and et cetera, what animals I was going to raise, et cetera. Is that a way that a new farmer coming on to a property that is not already in the program could demonstrate their plan? In other words, they're going to the effort to build a farm plan. They submit that that's what they're going to do, and so they're not getting the assessor's approval because they're not going through that process. They're just creating the plan. Is that? Did you talk about that at the ARC?
Yeah, David Kane here again. Yeah, we did talk about that, and we certainly would love to have the conservation district play a role in this process. And I think perhaps a farm plan is maybe it's simple enough, and a farm plan is even a lesser threshold in my mind, and the Schedule F could come later. But the annual certification, I know it's an extra burden to community development. However, we're hitting head on some of the most important issues in our community, and that's housing and housing for our working class and for things that are fundamentally the basis for the rural character. I don't think we can have rural without farm, and we can't have farm without farmers. So if we really believe in rural character and we want it to be something besides a mowed field with some hay bales, we need to support the most basic level, young farmers, and we need to make sure that we don't have artificial barriers that are preventing them from being able to get established. And as we know, housing here is so hard. And show me a farmer that's making very much money anyway. So it's incredibly difficult business, and I know that there's some downside risk, and it's something that we are worried about endlessly at the Agricultural Resource Committee, is we just don't want a policy we push forward at any point to get gamified. But I think, we run a greater risk of the erosion of our rural character if we don't have young farmers enter the market. And currently, strong belief within the farming community that we have far too many barriers right now, and that prevent housing, which then fundamentally prevents our ability to grow our farm community.
Well, this is Tim. It seems to me that the option 1B with the additional provisos that have just been suggested makes some sense. You'd wind up with. It seems to me that community development would wind up getting an annual certification, and could look at Schedule F to verify that whatever the minimum there would be. Not suggesting you'd have to audit them every year, although we have received some comments about how you're going to check this. But you could do a sample, and people would never know. And so, there would be a way to do some rolling sampling to verify that folks were in fact employed in agricultural activity on the premises, and that would address the concerns that I've heard anyway.
Camille, this is Mike. Can I?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Steve.
I had a question about this. Are we talking about year-round accommodations for farm workers? In other words, having a farm and then having a number of people working on that farm. Are you talking about creating accommodations for them to live year-round?
I believe that's the.
It's this is Adam. It's both, or it can be either year-round or seasonal. The farm worker accommodations is general enough that it doesn't exclude either.
Okay, well, my question about that is, if someone is going to be living on farm year-round, they're going to have in other words, an accommodation that's going to be, I don't know how to put this, but more complete. It's not like it's a temporary kind of thing. It's going to be like you're going to be adding another house or another habitation, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. I'm not sure. And that in itself, dramatically increases, the density of, the land there. And so I'm unclear about what how that fits in with our idea about what's rural, and with in a sense you're creating increased density, and I support that idea about having a certain number. So I'm wondering whether there should be some kind of like limitation on how many new homes, so to speak, you're going to provide on a certain size of land.
Well, I think in some cases they were talking bunkhouses. That doesn't sound like year-round habitation, but
no. And the regulations limit the number of accommodations, so you can only accommodate up to 10 workers and their families. So that's a bit of a cap there, and also the idea that that this is allowing more development. That's why we have this regulation, and why we're concerned about removing the requirement, is because we're granting this extra development to help farmers out, but we want to have the added guarantee that they will be operating as a farm today, and if they're participating in current use and open space, then they will be operating as a farm in the future too, presumably. So that's part of the trade-off, right? We're trading some additional development rights for those added benefits, but we want to make sure that we have good requirements in place so that we're so that the county is getting out of what they're putting in. I hope that made sense.
So
Yeah,
so
but I mean,
if somebody has a 25-acre farm,
Yeah.
then they could have as many as 10 housing units to accommodate workers.
Right, but they wouldn't necessarily be complete dwelling units. So
no, but the question, Camille, isn't your question that they could be complete dwelling units?
Yes, that's my question.
it's the definition is not specific, so it doesn't necessarily say that it couldn't be. It says that you can accommodate up to 10 workers.
But even if you did, you'd still have to be on the 1 acre.
Right. So that's where the other development standards come in too.
Yeah, so you'd potentially be taking 1 acre out of future agricultural or direct agricultural use, but that's not even necessarily true. It depends on the nature of the habitation you put in.
Right.
This is
Mike.
Steve again. Can
Yeah.
I?
Oh, go ahead.
Um, so I'm assuming it says provided up to 10 persons, and I assume that has to do with 10 farm workers. Does that include other members of their family, or are they additional to this? And so, talking about you could have up to 10 individual, homes year round with 10 farm workers and their extended family. All of a sudden, you've got this huge amount. I'm not saying, my concern is that wouldn't work very well on 10 acres on R10. Maybe it might work better on a 40-acre piece. So
I misspoke
in there.
Sorry. Yeah. I misspoke earlier. It's the farm worker accommodations are limited to just 10 persons. That 10 workers and their family, it comes from the state code. So the farm worker accommodations cannot accommodate more than 10 persons, 10 people.
That's good.
So, Camille, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Mike. So the question I have, so they have to have adequate water and sewage, right?
Yes.
So if I'm not mistaken, septic systems are developed by number of bedrooms. Like we have a 7-bedroom septic here. So presumably, to do this, they would be required to have at least a 10-bedroom system. That's number one. And number two is, what happens to these accommodations if they stop farming? Are they allowed to remain on the property? And what keeps them therefore for being used for other than ag purposes? That's it.
So David King, Camille, can I respond?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, so we need to think this out in a little broader terms. We need to be thinking about farm succession. So we have an existing beautiful farm somewhere on one of the islands, and the farmers are aging out. They want nothing more than to share their knowledge and transition that to a new generation. So they recruit some new young farmers to come take over the farm. Now, these folks that own the farm maybe don't want to move out of their farmhouses where they'd like to spend out their days. And we want the new farmers to come over and take over the operation and get the generational knowledge transfer and keep farming. So currently, if we house those people right now under the existing code, perhaps they're breaking the law. And we need to find solutions where we can have successful succession of farms. And that's a great example, because this is one that plays out very frequently around the county, is We get tripped up with this very issue, and maybe the new farmers that come in have 3 kids. So now we've got a family of 5 plus the original 2 farmers that want to stay on the farm. Is that wrong? I don't think it is, and I think we need to have the flexibility to ensure these big farms don't get sold off and further subdivided. And again, we're selling our rural character out from underneath us. So sure, there is probably some permeations here that are less desirable, but I don't know of any farms around the county that could or even use 10 farm workers. And if they did house, it would be a few and mostly seasonal. So I think that we can envision all sorts of terrible scenarios, but the likelihood is most likely the one I'm talking about initially is this farm secession, and we have the most to lose if we don't address it.
Mike, to return to your question, sorry, this is Adam. Mike, you had a question. If the farm stopped being used as a farm, what would happen to the accommodations? So then that's the primary concern here, and why the original code has this assessor's tax category requirement, because that provides some penalties. Because otherwise, the accommodations would still be there, but then they'd be counter to their permit, because the permit's going to be conditioned that they work on site and that the accommodations only be provided to folks that are employed in agriculture. So it kind of creates a can of worms. That scenario you described, it kind of creates a can of worms in a problematic situation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and David, I'm very sensitive to yours. You know, I was heavily involved in ag and believe that lack of farm workers is a big barrier to the success of our agricultural economies. So I would like to find some common ground, but I do think I think about the farms that I've seen around here, and maybe it's because they don't have farm workers because they can't afford to live here. They do have maybe a couple seasonal farm workers if they're lucky, they're young kids or something. Maybe we could narrow this down from the possibility there could be 10 new buildings with 30 people in them to something like a bunkhouse or something that is more consistent with what we view as necessary. And as far as your new farmer coming in while an old farmer lives there, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's an issue, but it does allow to build another residence on a property, assuming the zoning is there. I mean, I assume all this is within the zoning, right? Like if it's a 40-acre, you have zoning requirements. You couldn't build more than, I think, 2 residences on 40 acres. If it's R20, it's 2 residents on 20 acres, I think. So there's some limitation anyway, isn't there? Or are these in addition to those?
Let's let Erica answer that.
This is Erica. So there is not a density consideration. And so that's part of our concern is that once you've removed the eligibility, if you don't have either, say it's ag resource land, or you could have somebody on rural farm forest or 5-acre or a 2-acre piece of property that's trying to use this provision.
So correct me if I'm wrong. Is the staff recommendation basically business as usual, or is it include some new creative solutions?
The staff recommendation includes that you either have to participate in the program, which is how it currently is, or you have to demonstrate that you're eligible in your application for farm worker accommodations. So it is a change. The staff recommendation is a change. It's kind of a compromise between just removing the requirement entirely and keeping the requirement as is.
Just real quick, just a correction to that. The staff recommendation actually has ag resource land designation or eligible for.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
This is Tim. I've been listening to this very intently because I didn't get some of these nuances at all from what I had read to date. Is there a reason why incorporating a square footage limitation wouldn't help with some of this. It would, if you did that, if we came up with what the right number was, it would enable both the transition, it would enable the transition situation to work, or it would enable a farm to bring on, to provide permanent housing for somebody who's going to work at the farm for, forever, probably. It would allow some of those things without resulting in 1 acre lot line to lot, acre line to acre line, diversion of resource land. Would that not help some of the concerns that we've been talking about here? I mean, coupled with the Schedule F, or even if it were going to be establishing eligibility for, although not in the assessor's program, whatever that standard is. It seems like what we're wrestling with isn't that necessarily, because it's these other issues. How do we know for sure it's going to continue? How do we know it's going to continue? You don't really know, because somebody could go into bankruptcy, avoid the penalty, and or have it follow them around or whatever. You don't know for sure. The best you can do is put in place a system that is designed to protect what we want to protect. That's the ag resource and the character, and our community, quite frankly. And so, to me, it seems like the investment of a maximum of an acre out of your farm parcel is pretty good, unless we're talking about building a small community there, in which case we've got a unregulated rural cluster. But if we put in some limitation on the size, then it's not that, it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal. But the question I don't know is, does that even work? Does that advance the objective of this, or am I just making stuff up sitting here in my chair?
Well, it seems that a maximum square footage could work, but Adam?
Well, so I think that would get at the issue of kind of the character and the conversion of agricultural land. The thing that we're wrestling with here, I think, is how do we confirm that the land is actually being used for agricultural uses? And so that's where we get at. If it's designated ag land, it's probably being used for ag. If it's participating in current use or open space, it's definitely being used for ag. And then if it's eligible, then it's being used for ag, because there's a dollar amount per acre that you have to demonstrate. So those are the ways that we can confirm that, because we don't necessarily want to let just anybody develop these in the rural areas, because it's intended for ag uses.
That's true. I mean, you don't want non-farms or masquerading farms, right?
Right.
But,
and so we want to figure out how do we confirm that in a way that still allows folks that aren't participating in current use or open space, that are still farmers. But
let me ask this: how real do we think the risk is of the masquerade farm, of somebody acquiring an ag resource parcel for purposes of housing 10 people? Does that make any sense?
It seems that if you have a loophole, somebody will find a way to exploit it, and so we don't want to rely on the good faith of that. Yeah.
No, maybe so, but what it goes to is how much effort we have to put into policing it. If it's not a very big risk, then you put these upfront things in place so that you've got an attestation that you meet the requirements, or you look at a Schedule F, and granted that's going to be in arrears, but you've got something there that demonstrates something, and then you at least have in there that the Department of Community Development has authority to audit, and we could have a discussion about what that audit policy ought to look like. Whether you ought to have a random sample that you do every year just to avoid looking like you're targeting somebody, or whether you put together a reasonably designed system that targets based on a risk assessment or something. You can make it as complicated as you want, but my question of how much risk is it that somebody's really going to buy an ag resource parcel for purposes of running a bootleg boarding house? Now, maybe they would, but if the risk is, in the assessment of people who have more knowledge than I do about it, incredibly small, then you do a risk assessment in deciding how much you audit anyway.
Erica, did you have a comment?
Just really, I just want to be really clear. The current regulation does not have, it doesn't restrict farm worker housing to just ag resource. It allows it anywhere, as long as you are eligible or you're in the tax class. So what we're suggesting with the changes is that if you're not in the tax class or you're not eligible in the tax class, that you be an ag resource. That's the staff recommendation. And I think the ag resource committee is saying their recommendation is that you are you don't have to be eligible. And there is no restriction on lot size, and there's no if you take that section out, there is no restriction on it being ag resource or anything like that. It's just anywhere you can have ag farm worker housing. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong,
So then my question becomes, and I'm just coming at this cold because it's not something I thought about before I got this briefing paper. Really is from what the ARC knows, how much real farming is going on in non-resource land? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's certainly allowed, but
yeah,
how much of a problem is that?
Can I speak to that?
Please.
Yeah.
Thanks,
so
David.
so the problem with ag resource land is the parcels are substantially larger, and most of the farms, honestly, the small farms are happening on rural farm forest or forest parcels. That's my general read on it. We did a mapping project a couple of years ago, and the big parcels are generally the ag resource parcels, and I think they're the least accessible to new farmers.
Okay,
so,
that's what I wanted to know. I wasn't sure.
And to go back,
I was totally in the dark.
So one more, and I don't have any quantified data on that. I'm sorry, but the downside risk of not addressing this, I think, is greater than the risk of a few bad apples gamifying it. And if we look at vacation rentals, I mean, how many vacation rentals are non-compliant? I just don't think that people are going to find a farm parcel and try to put it on Airbnb. They're going to do that with their waterfront parcel or the parcels that people come to the island to enjoy as tourists, not a farm. So there could be a very small amount of people that choose to break the rules, but I don't think that should. I think the downside risk of that is far greater, that we lose the ability to farm and lose these big parcels because we don't have a way for there to be effective farm succession, and we have too many barriers for new farmers, and when we know that we have a farmer age base at 65 and aging out.
Camille, this is Steve. My concern has to do with about the changes in density. I mean, personally, I've got 40 acres, and I'm in the process of coming up with a lease with a farmer who doesn't own the land, but who is going to farm it for 15-year lease with a chance to renew it after 15 years. And she's 33, and, she's going to, I'm not sure I'm going to make it to the 15-year end of the lease, but it'll stay with the property. So here's an opportunity for somebody to go ahead and farm. Now, she and her husband do have a piece of property nearby that they're going to build their own house on. However, if she didn't have that and she requested the possibility of building one structure on the 30 acres of the 40 that she's going to farm, I'd consider that. That would be a good thing. I wouldn't want to see housing for her and maybe 5 or 6 other people. I think that would be too dense. So doesn't seem to be anything in here that says something about the change in the density when you go ahead and do this.
Well, other than the 1 acre. So.
And the likelihood of needing 4 or 5 more people to farm that size property.
Camille, this is Mike.
Yeah.
I'm really perplexed because this is a big barrier to agricultural growth in our county. We used to be the biggest agricultural county in the state, and it's expensive to live here. That's why we don't have many workers. It sure seems that we ought to be able to figure out a way to design, maybe not the perfect system, but one that allows some additional density, either temporarily or, which I would think would be good, but also year round, and doesn't hurt our rural character and doesn't hurt the stress on our resources. I just think this seems a little open-minded. I mean, open-ended. But I think we can find something that could help accommodate that. I'm just not sure this is it.
Well, this is Tim. Just trying to get to an answer. It seems to me we need to have an initial determination standard for what's a farm, right? And then we need some way. And I think an annual attestation would probably be fine. You'd list out who the people were and assert that they were working for you. Is there wiggle room there? Sure. Somebody might work for you for a week or a couple weeks or a month and stay with you all summer. So what? What's the major downside there? It's still the same. It's still the same impact on the land, so to speak. So it also sounds as though we've got at least two distinct situations. One is the situation that has been described related to this transition situation. You're going to have the outgoing farmer and the incoming farmer and family on both on the parcel. So that's 2 single-family homes on the parcel. The other one is a situation where you've got a farmer in place, and that farmer wants to provide a full-time residence for some workers. So if we put in a square footage limitation, that becomes a building or something, or we could make that be the case. If that would address most of the situations, when we're talking about permanent structures as opposed to temporary structures, what's wrong with that? What am I missing there that makes the risk too high of abuse in that situation?
This is Steve. I think that's good, Tim. In other words, and the real question is what is going to be the square footage that we, what's the limit?
Yeah, because that square footage thing, if we get it right, would accommodate both the transition situation and this other situation. You just build what you needed, and or modify what you needed if things changed on the same parcel. But it would seem to me that would get us most of the way there, and then the temporary provisions we haven't even gotten to those yet, right?
Right. That's the next issue we'll look at. So next month when we come back to this at your September meeting, we can take a look at what a square footage limit could be for these. That wasn't really that wasn't included in the staff report, but that's exactly the kind of thing that we wanted to get. If you had other ideas, those are the kinds of other ideas we would like to get. We still haven't really arrived at that first part of what you were talking about, Tim, which is how do we determine that the farm is being used as a farm? That's kind of the core of this first issue. And we haven't really narrowed down like what is that? How are we going to when somebody's applying for this? How do they show us that they are an active farm? And that's what we're hoping to narrow down a bit here.
Well, we've got suggestions, and none of them is great, at least in the first year, based on what we're talking about, because it sounds as though, from what David has told us, we were in a situation where we're not talking about folks who are actually in open space. I suppose that could come up if you were in a situation to do the transition thing. That would make a great deal of sense. But otherwise, in or not in that situation, we've got this thing. So you could make the representation in your application that you are farming, and in the following year we'd find out whether you filed it that way with the IRS. It's not ideal, but we're looking. What we're anticipating is continuity and continuation of a farm. So our risk is 1 year and one structure of a size not yet decided. That's the downside. But how much risk is that? In fact, if you went that way, it doesn't even mean you had to make any money. It just means you had to file.
Yeah. Okay.
So your proposal is that there would be a square footage limit on the accommodations and an annual certification that you're
farming. I've always had a problem. I've always had a little bit of a problem with the idea that you actually have to succeed, right? Because that's not always going to be true, so yeah, no, I don't want to say you can have farm accommodation if you manage to make money. What I want to know is if you're trying, if you're actually doing farming. The fact that something happens and you don't make a certain threshold of profit, that doesn't undercut the notion that the land was used for farming and the habitation was used for farm workers. It's still farming. It's a different problem, but it's not this problem.
This is Steve again. If you look at all the small farming, and in fact even the big farming here, what's left of it here in the islands, following up on Tim's comment about making a living on it, most of them are frequently, they have other means of getting, income. Okay. So farming is part of it, but they also may be involved in other activities so that they can, live. And so that the idea about having to demonstrate that you make a living, the young woman that's farming on my property probably, she'll probably break even. I think that's what she's been doing in the last couple of years. But her husband works and he has a pretty good living. So between the two of them, they do okay. But it allows her to continue to do the farming. And I appreciate that.
Okay, so
and I actually think that's consistent with the history of a lot of rural America anyhow. So for a lot of years anyway. So that is what I'm suggesting, that's a risk that seems to me worth taking.
So Adam, do you want to incorporate that into what you bring next month?
We will take a look at that for next month. Yes.
All right.
I don't know if there's. I think we've covered this issue as far as we can today, unless anybody has anything more to add on issue 1.
I think we've vetted it pretty thoroughly.
Okay. So looking at issue 2 for farm worker accommodations, one of the big issues that has come up is providing these kinds of accommodations in temporary things like tiny homes on wheels or recreational vehicles. The county code is not explicit about how, as we've been talking about, the code's really not specific about how farmers accommodate their workers. And the definition of accommodations is broad enough to include temporary options like RVs. But the code does not include more specific requirements about those impermanent accommodations. Some of the benefits of spelling that out in the code is that the farmers would understand their options for housing temporary workers. These temporary accommodations could be less expensive as opposed to like building a permanent structure. It doesn't require permanent development on farmland, but it still supports those farmers, allowing them to find new workers. And then also establishing some standards would help to ensure that workers are not housed in substandard arrangements, because we would be getting a permit application for that. Some of the drawbacks to temporary accommodations that they might not be engineered for continuous habitation up to like 6 months. Neighboring property owners might object to the visual appearance of those temporary structures, and expanding the on-site septic to accommodate the accommodations on site could be cost prohibitive for some farmers. So we've looked at possibly amending the performance standards for farm worker accommodations to include temporary accommodations, but we're not required to make that change. Which we recommend adopting those performance standards for temporary accommodations, because this would provide the farmers with that flexibility for accommodating their workers, but it would also help us establish a clear limit to how long those temporary living quarters may accommodate those workers. In the staff report, we recommend a limit of 180 days. So here we'll return to discussion on this.
Can I just jump in here? This is Tim again, just to try and move us forward. I have a couple questions.
Okay.
One, well, and first a comment. I don't think we have any reason to care about what the neighbors think, because this is a right to farm question. This is a farming operation. This is part of farming, is making sure you've got the people for this. So the fact that it's a residential use, I don't think makes any difference at all. I would argue that it can't be a nuisance because it's part of operating a farm. So that's what I would argue. I don't know if there's a counter argument to that. But beyond that, so what happens? You've got an RV of some sort. You've got somebody living in it for 180 days, and then they go to do whatever they do in the off season. It's probably not as tidy as that, but whatever it is, they go to do whatever their winter hustle is. So that's what they're doing. Is there a problem that RV sits in the same spot, or does somebody have to move it? And if so, why?
No, there wouldn't be a problem with that. We just don't want to be permitting something where somebody's living in a temporary accommodation that's not really supposed to be lived in year round. So we don't want to permit that to happen. So this would help establish that kind of limit. But you could keep it parked in the same place as long as somebody's not living in there.
Yeah, but you'd have no way to know that, really, I guess. Because this one seems like a no-brainer to me of some sort, that we make this flexibility available, because it's making the housing available when the persons need it. And this actually would seem like a boon, because in agriculture we'd be allowing this, whereas in other seasonal industries wouldn't be in a position to do that, at least not based under this type of policy. But I still think that's okay, because in this case it's part of farming. It's a kind of traditional part of farming too, the sort of the bunkhouse approach. Although on wheels is maybe an easier way to get into it, because in the current environment I think there's a lower barrier to entry than there was. So
I felt the same way when I was considering this, that this does seem like a pretty straightforward issue. Yeah.
I would not be at all surprised if somebody lives in it in the winter. Just maybe not the same somebody. But I'm not sure I care, really. But
all right. that
because things are protected as long as the septic is handled properly, and maintenance is handled on those facilities. I'm not sure why the county would have or ought to have a problem.
Right. Are there other comments or questions about this?
I see none.
Okay. So issue 3 for farm worker housing is the state farm worker housing. The public often has questions about how state regulated farm worker housing works here. So for some background, the state allows temporary farm worker housing that overrides the local land use regulations. Our local review of the state farm worker housing is limited to height, setback, and road access. Because this is a state permitting process, our county code doesn't have any regulations for this use or really say anything about this use. So the public is often unaware about how this state program works or the state permitting works because it's not considered in the code. The county could address this issue by adding temporary farm worker housing licensed by the state to our land use tables and adopting some very basic performance standards for it. And this would really clarify for the public what is allowed. But another option is to make no change. Because this is a state code thing, we don't really need to adopt it into our code. And for this reason, staff recommends making no change. It's probably a better way to get this information out there through like an informational brochure that would include like what regulations apply and then which state agencies to contact. That could help kind of clarify the issue without duplicating the state code in our local code. So I would turn this over to you.
So, as a practical matter, what's the difference?
Right, there really wouldn't be a difference. It would just we could really spell out we could spell it out in the code, or we could make an informational brochure that's not adopted in our code, which is probably more advantageous because then if the state code changes, we don't necessarily have to amend our county code.
Well, I was thinking that we could handle it in the code by merely making essentially an informational reference to the or a statement that in addition to or whatever the state rules, just so that it's clear that it's there if folks looked. I suspect people understand that, but I didn't understand any of that either until I read this document.
Yeah, what we find is that we get a lot of questions from folks that know that there's something out there, but don't, because our code doesn't reference it, or we don't have any we don't have a handout ready to go. They don't necessarily know the ins and outs of who to contact at the state for that. So
in practice, how much of what is, I mean, how much of the state rule is being used in the county, or do we even know? And if we don't know, is it just that it's not being, well, I don't know, or is it just that nobody's noticed, or is it being used and it's proved not to be a problem for people?
I don't know. I don't believe we have any permitted in the county off the top of my head. This is kind of one of those things that was developed for like heavier in agricultural use, like in Eastern Washington, where they have migrant labor to ensure that seasonal migrant workers are housed in housing that's at least been reviewed by someone, that they have a basic health and safety provisions. So I don't know if we have any here because we don't have a lot of agricultural operations that are bringing in migrant workers, to my knowledge.
Yeah, David Kane here. I don't really believe this is the option 3 is really applicable to us, or issue 3.
Okay.
Well, it is because somebody could develop the state. It applies to us because anyone in the state that's operating a farm can develop these temporary accommodations. It's just I don't think we have anybody that's done it here yet.
And to clarify, that's what I meant with my comment.
Okay.
I don't believe anyone here is currently utilizing it. We've looked at it, and we didn't feel like it really suited our context. It's more of a, like you said, Eastern Washington thing, and I think it's more intent to protect the farm workers from than anything.
Okay. So now that wraps up our discussion of farm worker accommodations. Looking ahead, we've got quite a bit more, and I would ask the commission if they want to keep pushing through until 4:30 when we've got to go, or just pick up this conversation next month, or kind of how are we feeling about the issue?
I think taking it past 4 o'clock is problematic, but I'd like to have the other commissioners weigh in. Michael?
Yeah, I'm tired, but I'll slug through if everybody else wants to. Otherwise, next month's okay with me.
David?
Yeah, I will defer to the Madam Chair.
And Tim?
Well, I would be good either way. The observation I have is that there are lots of folks in the public very curious, at least about what we're going to say about vacation rentals. There's another smaller group I think who's curious about the ADU issue. So I think that's of a different magnitude. And then the rural clusters issue, I would recommend we put off because I think it's very important, and we should be at our better.
Right. Okay. So
not that the vacation rentals isn't. I think that's very important as well, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that I think we should try to clarify. And then we've got the very tough question of that's been put to us, and it amounts to whether we're really going to do something or not.
yes.
So, I mean, I think that's how I look at it. And well, let me save the speech. I think because I think we ought to. I'll be fresh and have a nice solid blood sugar level when we do that too. So
maybe we should just adjourn for today and take it up next month. I mean, I think if we start on vacation rentals, I mean, first of all, we're not fresh. And secondly, it's going to take longer than 35 minutes. So we might as well give it the justice it deserves. And so I think we should postpone until the September meeting.
This is
the question.
Steve, I support.
Go ahead, Steve, sorry.
I support that. Let's adjourn now, and we'll be ready to go next month.
Before we make that motion, Adam, what's that do to us in terms of?
I think that's okay. We'll just we were already planning to return to these issues next month in looking ahead at the agenda, so that'll fit in. I would say that if between now and then, if you're reviewing this information or the staff reports, and you have points that you would like the staff to consider or to come back with, you can direct those to Linda, and she can send those on to me so that we can make sure that we're prepared for next time. If there are like questions about, I don't know, some of the data that's presented, or if you want more background, those kinds of things, we can address those. We've got some time now too.
Thanks. I move we adjourn.
Oh, Tim, if you can just hold on one second, I need clarification, and it may be fine, but when you were just talking about the previous 3 issues on the farm worker, you have staff coming back on square footage and monitoring certificate. Nothing was said about issue 2 and 3. Are you accepting the choice of the staff, or are we just going on without saying anything about them? There was no indication. So I just want to make sure that I didn't miss something or not say something.
Well, Adam, would you like to? I thought with issue 3, we let it stand. I'm sorry, I don't recall what was that issue option.
Yeah, we didn't formally get the consensus, I suppose, on those 2.
On those 2.
My impression was that you were okay with the staff recommendation on issue 2, and that was to adopt a standard for temporary farm worker accommodations. And then it seemed that you were also okay with option B for issue 3.
Okay.
I believe that's correct. But that's my perception.
Consensus, does all the planning commission agree that those in that reflection of Adams about what?
I think it's time.
Steve, I agree.
Thank you.
David agrees.
Thank you. Tim?
Mike agrees.
Oh, sorry. If it was muddled, Tim agrees as well.
Thank you. And Camille? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Tim,
Where's that motion?
to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second,
Oh, thank you.
Mike.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, everybody take care.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
I'm being able to
People have
call
got
in.
off already.